My wife had been buried for less than 2 hours when someone handed me a phone and said, "Richard, I think you need to see this." I was still standing outside the church in Charleston, South Carolina, holding the folded program from Margaret's funeral when I looked down at the screen. There was my son, Jason, wearing sunglasses, smiling beside his wife Ashley on a white sand beach somewhere in the Caribbean. In his hand was a bright tropical drink. Across the photo he had written, "Living our best life." I stared at the screen so long that Helen Parker finally whispered, "Richard, are you all right?" "All right." My wife of 51 years had just been laid to rest, and my only son had skipped her funeral to post vacation pictures online. A few minutes earlier, people had been asking me the same question over and over. Will Jason be arriving soon? Did he get delayed? Is your son coming for the service? Every question felt like another stone being placed on my chest. If stories about family, loyalty, and second chances speak to your heart, please consider liking this video and subscribing, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world today, leave your city, your country, and your local time in the comments below. I'd love to know where you're joining me from. My name is Richard Bennett. I am 74 years old, and this is the story of the day my family shattered in ways I never thought possible. The lesson I learned changed everything, and if you stay until the end, you may see why. And now, let me take you back to where it all began. 3 days before the funeral, I had called Jason personally. "Your mother doesn't have much time left," I told him. "You need to come home." There was a pause before he answered. "Dad, Ashley and I already paid for this trip." I remember gripping the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles turned white. "Jason, your mother is dying." "I know," he said quietly, "but she wouldn't want us throwing everything away." I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream. "Instead," I said, "your mother spent her entire life putting this family first." He sighed heavily. "Dad, I can't do this conversation right now." Then he hung up. Margaret passed away the following morning. Peacefully. At least that's what everyone kept saying. Peacefully. But there was nothing peaceful about watching the woman who had shared every chapter of your life simply disappear. Nothing peaceful about sitting beside an empty hospital bed. Nothing peaceful about walking into a house that suddenly felt too large and too quiet. During the funeral service, I kept glancing toward the church doors. Part of me still believed Jason would walk in at the last second. Maybe he'd surprise me. Maybe he'd realize what mattered. Maybe he'd remember the mother who sat through every baseball game, every school play, every difficult season of his life. But the doors never opened. The seat reserved for him remained empty from beginning to end. After the service, people offered condolences. Some hugged me. Some cried. Some avoided eye contact entirely because they knew what everyone else knew. My son wasn't there. Then came the photographs. Then came the comments beneath them. "Looks amazing. Enjoy paradise. You too deserve it." Every word felt like salt in an open wound. That evening, I sat alone in my study. The house was silent except for the ticking grandfather clock Margaret had loved for decades. I was staring at her framed photograph when my phone vibrated on the desk. At first, I almost ignored it. Then I looked down. The blood drained from my face. The message had come from Margaret's phone number. My wife had been dead for 2 days. Yet there on the screen were 4 words that made my heart nearly stop. "Richard, come home now." I froze, because the phone that sent that message was supposed to be locked inside a drawer upstairs. And suddenly I realized there might be something Margaret had known before she died, something none of us understood yet. For several seconds I could not move. I simply stared at the glowing screen, reading those 4 words again and again. "Richard, come home now." My hands were shaking. Margaret's phone had been turned off the day she passed away. I knew because I had placed it in the top drawer of her nightstand myself. Yet somehow a message had just arrived. I slowly stood from my chair and walked upstairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. The hallway seemed darker than usual. The house we had shared for more than 50 years suddenly felt unfamiliar. When I reached our bedroom, I opened the drawer. The phone was still there, exactly where I had left it. I picked it up and saw a small notification on the screen. A scheduled message. My heart pounded. Margaret had arranged it before she died. But why? What was she trying to tell me? As I sat on the edge of the bed holding the phone, memories began flooding back. Jason had not always been the man he was now. At least that was what I had spent years telling myself. When he was 8 years old, he used to wait by the front window every evening for me to come home from work. The moment my truck pulled into the driveway, he would run outside yelling, "Dad's home." Margaret would laugh from the porch and say, "You two are exactly alike." Back then, our family felt simple. We were not wealthy. We lived in a modest house outside Charleston. I worked long hours. Margaret managed everything else. Somehow she always made our home feel warm. I remember one Christmas when money was tight. Jason wanted a bicycle. We could not afford one. I told Margaret, "Maybe next year." She looked at me and said, "He only gets one childhood, Richard." A week later, I discovered she had secretly sold a necklace she loved to buy him that bicycle. On Christmas morning, Jason screamed with joy and wrapped his arms around her. "Best mom ever," he shouted. Margaret cried happy tears. Years later, when Jason was 16, something started changing. Small things at first. He became impatient, entitled. If he did not get exactly what he wanted, he acted as though the world had wronged him. One afternoon, he came home angry because another student had received a scholarship. "That should have been mine," he complained. Margaret calmly asked, "Did you apply?" He shrugged. "No." She stared at him for a moment and said, "Then someone else earned it." Jason rolled his eyes. "You always take everyone else's side." The words hurt her more than he realized. I could see it in her face. Later that night, I found her washing dishes quietly. "He did not mean it," I said. She gave me a sad smile. "Richard, sometimes loving someone means noticing who they are becoming." At the time, I thought she was worrying too much. I wanted to believe Jason would mature. I wanted to believe every fatherly excuse I made for him. Looking back now, I realized Margaret saw things years before I did. She noticed patterns I ignored. She recognized warning signs I explained away. Sitting there in our bedroom, I unlocked her phone. There was only one new item. A calendar reminder scheduled for the exact evening after her funeral. Attached to it was a short note. Just one sentence. My stomach tightened as I read it. "If you are reading this, start with the cedar box in the study." Suddenly, I remembered something strange from 6 months earlier. Margaret had insisted on moving an old cedar box into my study herself. When I asked why, she simply smiled and said, "One day, you will understand." At the time, it seemed harmless. Now it felt like the first piece of a much larger puzzle. And deep down, for the very first time, I began to fear that my wife had spent her final months preparing for something she knew was coming. I sat in my study for what felt like hours, the cedar box resting heavily on the desk in front of me. Every instinct in my body screamed to leave it alone, to ignore whatever Margaret had left, to let the grief wash over me and settle into quiet resignation. But something in her note, the way she had written it, made it impossible to ignore. I slowly lifted the lid, the cedar scent bringing a memory of our first house together, of Margaret arranging flowers in the living room, humming softly to herself. Inside were stacks of envelopes, meticulously labeled, and a small leather-bound journal. I pulled out the first envelope. It was addressed to me in her familiar, looping handwriting. I opened it and began to read aloud. "Richard, if you are seeing this, know that everything is not as it seems. Begin with the files in the middle drawer of the cabinet. Jason must not see these yet." My hands trembled, not from fear, but from an unexpected surge of clarity. For the first time in years, I felt that Margaret had left me more than memories. She had left me direction, and in that direction lay an opportunity one had never had before. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. "Dad, you are still up here." Helen's voice floated up the stairs. I paused, taking a breath, choosing not to react the way I usually did, which was to wave her in and explain. Instead, I simply called back, "Yes, Helen, come in." She entered, concern etched on her face. I saw the message, "Richard, are you okay?" I looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I did not feel broken. "I will be fine. Just reading something Margaret wanted me to see." She nodded slowly, sensing that something had shifted in me. "You know, she always trusted you to handle things," she said. That simple affirmation sparked a determination I had almost forgotten I possessed. I continued to sort through the envelopes, each one revealing details about our family's finances, small business investments, and correspondence Margaret had kept secret to protect me from decisions Jason had been making in the shadows. Among the papers were notes about properties, contracts, and even a handwritten record of some disagreements Jason had attempted to manipulate for his own gain. I realized, as I went through them, that I now held the keys to the very power Jason had tried to claim for himself. A plan began to form in my mind, not of revenge, but of reclamation, of restoring what was ours while honoring Margaret's wisdom. Then Ashley called. I let the call go to voicemail, refusing to answer in the moment. She would not yet know the changes unfolding. Later, I received a message from my sister, Patricia, who had always been protective of me. Richard, I heard about what happened. Are you managing okay? We should talk tomorrow. Her concern, usually familiar and comforting, now felt like another layer of accountability I was ready to embrace. I knew I could not move too quickly, or Jason would sense the shift, but every piece of Margaret's guidance was leading me forward. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had organized the files, made notes of priorities, and realized that the first step would be to confront certain truths in the family business. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, and felt a rush of purpose I had not known since before retirement. Somewhere deep down, I sensed that the next days would be critical. Something was about to change. Something that Jason and Ashley had never anticipated. And in that moment, as I carefully placed the cedar box back in its hidden compartment, I knew that this was only the beginning of a series of revelations that could alter the balance of our family forever. The next morning began with a phone call that changed the entire direction of what I thought I knew. It came from Thomas Reed, the attorney who had handled Margaret's estate planning for nearly 20 years. His voice sounded unusually serious. Richard, I need to ask you something before we meet. What is it? I replied. There was a pause. Why did you tell people you were stepping away from the family business? I sat upright in my chair. I never said that. Another silence followed. That is not what I have been hearing. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Less than an hour later, I drove into town and met Thomas at his office. He closed the door behind us and placed several documents on the conference table. Over the past 6 months, multiple people have contacted me saying you wanted to reduce your involvement in company decisions. I stared at him. Who said that? Thomas slid a page toward me. The first name nearly stopped my heart. Jason Bennett. Then there were others. Business partners. Accountants. Vendors. People I had known for years. Somehow a story had spread that I was becoming forgetful, overwhelmed, and no longer interested in managing important affairs. This is ridiculous, I said. I never told anyone that. Thomas nodded slowly. I believe you. The problem is that enough people heard it repeatedly that they accepted it as fact. That sentence hit me harder than I expected. I suddenly understood something Margaret had been trying to show me. This was not one misunderstanding. It was a carefully planted narrative, a seed that had been watered for months. As the day continued, the evidence became impossible to ignore. I visited one of our longtime business associates, a man named Carl Henderson. We had worked together for over 15 years. The moment I mentioned recent company matters, he looked uncomfortable. Finally, he sighed. Richard, I did not know how to bring this up. Bring what up? I asked. Carl shifted in his seat. Jason said you wanted him taking over more responsibility because you were having trouble keeping track of things. I felt my chest tighten. And you believed him? Carl looked embarrassed. Honestly, yes. He seemed concerned about you. Concerned. That word lingered in my mind all afternoon. Concern can be one of the most convincing disguises in the world. By evening, I had spoken with 5 different people. Every conversation revealed another version of the same story. Richard is slowing down. Richard wants to step back. Richard does not need to stress anymore. Richard wants Jason making more decisions. The lies had spread so naturally that nobody questioned them. Why would they? They trusted family. They trusted a son speaking about his father. When I returned home, I sat alone in the study reading through more of Margaret's notes. One page contained a list of dates. Beside each date was a short observation. Jason met with accountant alone. Jason requested copies of ownership records. Jason asked questions about trust documents. Jason told board members Richard wants less involvement. My hands trembled as realization washed over me. Margaret had been documenting everything. She had seen the pattern long before I did. Then I noticed something attached to the final page. A photocopy of a document I had never seen before. Across the top was a title that made my blood run cold. It was a proposal discussing future control of family assets. My name appeared throughout the document. Yet I had never signed it, never approved it, and never even known it existed. As I turned to the final page, my eyes landed on a section that changed everything. There, beside a date from 3 months earlier, was evidence that someone had already begun putting the plan into motion. And in that moment, the foundation of trust one had spent decades building with my son collapsed completely. I spent the entire morning trying to reach Jason, dialing his number over and over. Each time it rang, I imagined the words I would say, the pleading in my voice, and each time it went to voicemail, I felt a deeper weight settle in my chest. "Richard, I cannot answer your calls right now." His message finally played after the fifth attempt. I hung up, staring at the phone as though it had betrayed me too. Then I tried email, carefully composing a message that outlined the discrepancies I had discovered, attaching copies of Margaret's notes and the documents showing his manipulations. Subject: clarification and immediate discussion. I hit send and waited. 2 hours passed. No reply. I checked again, and still nothing. I found myself drafting a second email, more direct this time, my hands trembling. "Jason, this must be addressed immediately. The estate and family business are at stake." I sent it, and the silence persisted. Feeling the frustration mounting, I began writing a letter, carefully choosing my words so that any third party who read it would see the truth. I folded it, placed it in an envelope, and left it on his desk at home, hoping he would find it when he returned from his trip. Later, I called Ashley. She answered immediately, cheerful as ever. "Hi, Dad. I was wondering when you might call." "Ashley, we need to discuss several urgent matters regarding the estate," I said, keeping my tone controlled. She laughed lightly. "Oh, you always worry too much, Richard. Jason has everything under control. Why do you not relax for once?" Her words cut sharper than any confrontation could have. I reminded her of the evidence, of the documents, and of the emails I had sent to Jason. She giggled again. "Dad, you worry too much. Trust us. Everything is fine." The contrast between the severity of the situation and her dismissive tone left me stunned. By evening, I had tried every channel: phone calls, texts, emails, letters, even reaching out to mutual friends who might influence Jason. But each effort was met with ignorance or polite dismissal. "He will call when he is ready," Helen said when I broke down and told her what had happened. I nodded, but it felt hollow. Each failed attempt reminded me that Margaret's warnings had not been overcautious. She had anticipated the resistance I would encounter, the deliberate blindfolding of those around me. Alone in the house, I sat in the study with the cedar box open again, reviewing the notes and documents, trying to reconstruct a path forward. Every name, date, and record painted a picture of how carefully the lies and manipulations had been orchestrated. I realized that Jason had already succeeded in convincing others that I was out of touch, that I was no longer involved, and that any effort on my part to intervene would appear intrusive or unnecessary. Even the family attorney's office had fallen under the spell of Jason's narrative. I could sense their hesitation when I tried to schedule meetings. As the night deepened, I felt a profound isolation, as though I was the only person in the world who truly understood what was happening. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of cedar and old paper, and I recognized that the next steps I would take would not just be about correcting misperceptions, but about navigating a labyrinth of deception that had entrenched itself in every corner of my family. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted and frustrated, the weight of Margaret's absence pressing down on me, knowing that the only person I could rely on fully in this moment was myself. And that realization, though empowering, left me feeling profoundly alone and unsure how long I could endure the silence before the next revelation. I sat alone in the living room, the late afternoon light falling softly through the blinds, and felt the full weight of everything I had lost. Margaret was gone, and with her, the comfort of her presence, the laughter that filled our home, the certainty that no matter what happened, we faced it together. Jason was distant, unreachable, and the people I had thought I could trust, friends, neighbors, colleagues, had unknowingly taken his side, leaving me isolated. I held a photograph of Margaret on the mantel, tracing her smile with my finger, and whispered, "I do not know how to do this without you." The silence that followed was deafening. My phone buzzed, and I saw another email from an acquaintance who had been involved in family business matters. I opened it, hoping for some guidance or reassurance. Instead, it was another report confirming what I already suspected. Jason had manipulated meetings, misrepresented my intentions, and subtly shifted control away from me while I grieved. I closed my eyes and let out a long, measured breath, realizing I could no longer pretend that the situation was temporary or that my voice alone could correct it. Helen called shortly afterward. "Richard, I am here if you need to talk," she said gently. I sat quietly for a moment, letting the words wash over me, not yet ready to answer. Finally, I replied, "I know, Helen. I just need some time." Her voice carried warmth, but even her presence could not fill the void left by the absence of my wife and the betrayal of my son. I walked through the house, noting the small reminders of a life that had been interrupted. Margaret's teacup still sat on the side table by her favorite chair. Her knitting basket was untouched in the corner. Jason's room remained tidy, as if he had planned his absence in advance, leaving no sign of care or connection. I felt the emptiness of those spaces as acutely as a physical pain, and it struck me that mourning Margaret was not the only grief I was enduring. I had lost certainty, I had lost trust, and I had lost the illusion that family automatically meant support. Even the phone calls, emails, and letters I had sent in the last days, pleas for dialogue, evidence of manipulations, appeals for understanding, had gone unanswered or dismissed. Each unanswered message underscored the distance that had grown, not only physically but emotionally, between me and the people I had loved. As I sat back down in the study, the cedar box before me again, I opened Margaret's journal and read her carefully penned words. "Strength comes when you feel weakest. Pay attention, Richard. You are not alone, even when it feels that way." For the first time that day, I felt a flicker of awareness, a recognition that despite the deep loss, the betrayal, and the isolation, there was a path forward. The recognition was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, a quiet understanding that survival, clarity, and eventually, a return to balance, would require patience, reflection, and deliberate action. I closed the journal, placing it carefully back inside the cedar box, and looked around the room. The shadows were lengthening, yet there was a sense that the darkness could be navigated. Margaret had left me guidance, Jason had revealed his intentions, and the truth of what had been taken from me was clear. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to imagine the possibility of beginning again, a slow recovery from the loss and the betrayal, and a readiness to discover how to reclaim both the family legacy and my own sense of purpose. The following week, I stopped waiting for phone calls that never came. Instead, I began waking up at 6 every morning, making a pot of coffee, and sitting at the same desk where Margaret had left her notes. The difference was that I was no longer reading them as a grieving husband. I was reading them as someone preparing to rebuild. The first thing I did was schedule meetings with people I trusted directly, not intermediaries, not secondhand contacts, the actual decision makers. I met Thomas Reed for breakfast at a small diner overlooking the harbor. He studied me carefully across the table. "You seem different," he said. I smiled faintly. "I think I finally stopped hoping someone else would fix this." Thomas nodded. "That may be the most important step." Over the next several days, I reviewed every major business record, every trust document, and every property agreement Margaret had flagged. For years, I had gradually stepped back, believing the next generation would naturally assume responsibility. Now I realized that stepping back and disappearing were two very different things. One afternoon, I drove to our largest commercial property outside Charleston. The site manager, Mike Dawson, nearly dropped his clipboard when he saw me. "Richard, I had no idea you were coming." "Neither did I replied with a grin. We spent 2 hours walking the property. For the first time in years, I listened carefully to the details, the challenges, and the opportunities. Before leaving, Mike shook my hand. "It is good to have you back." Those simple words stayed with me all evening. They reminded me that my identity had never depended on the approval of family members. It had been built through decades of work, integrity, and relationships. Meanwhile, I started organizing Margaret's notes into a proper timeline. Every evening I sat at the dining room table, sorting documents into folders. One stack contained financial records. Another contained correspondence. A third contained observations she had quietly documented over several years. The more organized everything became, the clearer the picture grew. One afternoon, my sister Patricia stopped by unexpectedly, carrying a basket of homemade muffins. "You look better," she said as she entered the kitchen. "I feel better," I answered honestly. She looked surprised. "After everything?" I poured her a cup of coffee. especially after everything. Patricia studied me for a moment. Your wife would be proud of this version of you. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. Not happiness. Not yet. But stability. The kind that comes when a person finally accepts reality and begins working with it instead of fighting it. The most surprising part was that I accomplished all of this without any support from the people I had once expected would stand beside me. No calls came. No explanations arrived. No apologies appeared. Yet somehow, each day I became stronger. One evening, while reviewing a set of documents Margaret had marked with a red tab, I discovered something unusual. It was not evidence of wrongdoing. It was not another warning. It was a list of names. Business leaders. Community members. Former partners. Besides several names Margaret had written the same note. Trust these people when the time comes. I stared at the page for a long moment. Then I noticed a final handwritten message at the bottom. It read, Richard, if you have reached this point, you are closer than you think. The opportunity is already waiting for you. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Margaret had not merely prepared me for a crisis. She had prepared me for something far bigger that was about to enter my life. I arrived at the Charleston office that morning wearing a tailored navy blazer with the company crest stitched over the breast pocket, a small emblem that had once belonged to Margaret and now felt like a tangible reminder of her confidence in me. As I stepped through the glass doors, the receptionist looked up, recognition and surprise mingling in her expression. Mr. Bennett, she said, her voice a touch shaky. It is good to see you back. I nodded, smiling faintly but firmly, and continued down the corridor to the executive floor, where my presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. Employees who had previously deferred decisions now gathered around their desks, watching as I signed documents, provided guidance, and made decisive calls. I introduced myself formally to a group of junior managers, extending my hand with certainty. I am Richard Bennett, and I will be overseeing this project going forward. Their nods were subtle but sincere, and a sense of authority I had not felt in months settled over me. Later, I walked into the main conference room to find Thomas Reed and a few trusted advisors waiting. He gestured toward a large digital screen displaying charts and investment reports. Richard, we prepared this analysis for you, he said, sliding a tablet across the table. I reviewed the numbers and projections, my mind already forming strategies. Every calculation and insight aligned with Margaret's earlier notes, her foresight guiding my understanding. This is excellent, I said aloud, my voice steady. We will proceed with the renovations and allocate resources as indicated. Ensure the project timeline is maintained and that accountability is enforced at each stage. As I spoke, I noticed the confidence reflected in the team's posture. Even Mike Dawson, the property manager, looked invigorated. It is inspiring to see you leading this, sir, he said quietly as we reviewed site updates. I smiled, feeling a renewed connection to the work I had always loved and a validation of the knowledge Margaret had entrusted to me. The day continued with meetings and strategy sessions, each decision reinforcing my control and reminding me of the strength that came from preparation, clarity, and experience. Mid-afternoon, a visitor arrived unannounced. Patricia, my sister, holding a folder of historical records from previous projects. I thought these might help, she said. I accepted the folder gratefully, reviewing notes and blueprints that now made perfect sense in light of Margaret's guidance. Thank you, Patricia, I said. Your timing is impeccable. This will give us a clearer path forward. Her eyes softened, and she added, You are doing exactly what she hoped you would. As the sun began to set, I stood at the window overlooking the harbor, the golden light reflecting on the water, the office bustling quietly behind me. I felt the confidence that had eluded me for months return, not arrogantly, but firmly rooted in competence and purpose. Every action I took was deliberate, every decision backed by knowledge and clarity, and each step reaffirmed my role as both steward and leader. In that moment, I realized that while the challenges with family still lingered, I had reclaimed my authority and established a foundation strong enough to carry through to the future. And as I glanced at the calendar on my desk, the current day aligning with Margaret's meticulously planned notes, I felt a quiet reassurance that the path she had laid out was connecting seamlessly with the present, guiding me toward the next phase of what needed to be done. I arrived at the hospital lobby with a quiet determination that had been growing over the past weeks. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the faint smell of antiseptic mingled with the lingering scent of freshly polished floors. I checked in at the reception desk, stating my name firmly, and was directed to a private waiting room on the third floor. I took a seat, feeling the weight of the documents and Margaret's notes in my briefcase beside me. Across from me, a wall of frosted glass separated the room from the busy corridor, muffling footsteps but allowing shadows to move behind it. I adjusted my blazer, noticing the slight reflection of the company emblem in the glass, and reminded myself that I had reclaimed authority in the business, that I had prepared for this moment carefully. Soon after, Thomas Reed arrived, carrying his leather folder. He gave me a nod and placed the folder on the table. "Richard," he said quietly, "everything is ready, but you need to remain patient. Jason is expecting a routine meeting. He does not yet know the full extent of what you have discovered." I nodded, my pulse steadying, yet a tight anticipation filled my chest. We reviewed the summary of transactions, the documented meetings, and the evidence Margaret had left behind. Each piece of information reinforced the control I now held, and the understanding that the next step would be decisive. "This is all here for you," Thomas said, tapping the folder. "Every document Margaret collected, every discrepancy noted. You are fully prepared." I closed my eyes for a moment, drawing in a slow breath. "I understand. I will handle this with care and resolve." The minutes stretched. The corridor beyond the frosted glass seemed to elongate time itself. I could hear muffled conversations, the occasional beep from medical monitors, and the distant echo of a cart being pushed down the hallway. Then the door opened slightly, and Jason stepped in with a casual gait, unaware of the shift that had taken place. He smiled at Thomas and me, attempting an easy familiarity. "Good morning, Dad," he said, nodding toward me. I returned the nod without breaking eye contact, my presence now quiet but unmistakably firm. "Jason," I replied calmly, "thank you for meeting with us today." His smile faltered just slightly, though he masked it quickly. We sat around the small conference table. Thomas placed the folder at the center, and I allowed the weight of its contents to subtly fill the space between us. I began with measured questions, careful observations, and references to recent business decisions. Jason responded, occasionally deflecting or offering vague assurances, but each answer was met with gentle yet precise follow-ups that revealed inconsistencies. He started to shift in his seat, glancing briefly at Thomas, then back at me, a faint tension forming around his posture. I maintained composure, speaking slowly, deliberately, making each point land with clarity. "These are your reports from the last quarter," I said, tapping the folder. "Can you explain the discrepancies noted here?" Jason hesitated, clearing his throat. I do not see any problem," he replied, voice carefully neutral. Thomas interjected with additional documentation, and the room grew heavier with the unspoken tension. I leaned forward slightly, meeting Jason's gaze directly, my expression steady, measured. The clock on the wall ticked audibly in the silence. Every second seemed elongated, every subtle movement weighted with meaning. As Jason opened his mouth to respond again, I sensed the moment approaching, the turning point when everything would begin to unfold. And just as the tension reached its apex, the door to the conference room opened, and a figure entered that would change the entire atmosphere, making the next revelation unavoidable. The person who entered the room was not a lawyer, an accountant, or a business associate. It was Helen Parker. She carried a small sealed envelope and walked calmly to the table. Jason looked confused. "Helen, what are you doing here?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she placed the envelope in front of me. "Margaret asked me to deliver this only if certain conditions were met," she said softly. The room became completely silent. Thomas leaned back in his chair. I carefully opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter along with a flash drive. Jason's expression changed instantly. For the first time all morning, he looked genuinely uneasy. "What is that?" he asked. I looked at him. "Something your mother wanted preserved." Thomas connected the flash drive to the screen in the room. A video appeared. Margaret sat in her favorite chair at home, wearing a light blue sweater and holding a notebook in her lap. Her voice was calm and steady. "If this video is being watched, then Richard has finally reached the point where he needs the full truth. Jason immediately looked away from the screen. Margaret continued. This message is not about blame. It is about clarity. The room remained perfectly still. Over the last several years, I observed decisions being made without transparency. I documented concerns. I collected records. Most importantly, I prepared safeguards. Thomas opened another folder and distributed copies around the table. Jason picked one up. His face slowly lost color. Each page contained signed instructions, notarized amendments, and legal directives Margaret had established months before. Nothing emotional. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Clear, organized, undeniable facts. This cannot be right, Jason said quietly. Thomas answered before I could. Everything has been verified. Jason looked at me. For years I probably would have rushed to reassure him, to soften the moment, to avoid discomfort. This time I simply held his gaze. Your mother was thorough, I said calmly. The video continued. Richard always believed the best about people, Margaret said. That is one of the reasons I loved him. But sometimes protecting a family requires seeing what others choose not to see. Helen lowered her eyes. Even she seemed emotional hearing Margaret's voice again. Then came the part none of us expected. Margaret revealed that a new governance structure had already been activated before her passing. Independent oversight, external review authority, asset protections, leadership controls. Every major decision now required procedures that prevented any single individual from quietly taking control. The entire framework had already been legally implemented. Jason stared at the documents in disbelief. Nobody told me about this. Thomas folded his hands. That was intentional. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ashley suddenly entered the room after apparently arriving late to the meeting. She stopped when she saw the expressions around the table. What happened? She asked. Jason did not answer. He simply handed her the top document. She scanned the first page, then the second. Her confidence disappeared almost immediately. I remained seated, surprisingly calm. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just calm. Because this was no longer about winning an argument. It was about truth standing on its own. Ashley finally looked up. When was all this done? Helen answered quietly. Months ago. The realization spread across the room like a wave. They had spent all this time believing they understood the situation. They had assumed they knew who held influence, who held authority, and who was paying attention. Now they were discovering how wrong those assumptions had been. Jason slowly looked toward me. His eyes were filled not with anger, but with shock. And then Thomas opened one final folder and revealed the document that neither Jason nor Ashley had ever known existed. Thomas slowly opened the final folder and removed a notarized document bearing Margaret's signature, 2 witness signatures, and the seal of the attorney's office. There was nothing mysterious about it. No surprise discovery hidden in an attic. No forgotten paperwork suddenly appearing from nowhere. Margaret had created it legally, documented it properly, and left explicit instructions regarding when it should be presented. Thomas adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Jason. Your mother established this amendment 8 months ago. The room remained silent as he continued. It outlines future governance of the family assets, company interests, charitable holdings, and property management responsibilities. Jason swallowed hard. Ashley sat motionless beside him. Thomas handed copies across the table. As they reviewed the pages, the reality became impossible to ignore. Margaret had not concentrated authority in one person. Instead, she had created a structure based on accountability, transparency, and demonstrated responsibility. Certain leadership roles would be earned through participation, performance, and trust rather than assumed through family position alone. The document also confirmed something that changed the entire dynamic of the room. I had been designated as the primary steward of the structure for as long as I wished to serve. Not because I was her husband, because she explicitly stated that I had demonstrated consistency, judgment, and commitment over decades. Jason looked at me. You knew about this? No, I answered honestly. Not until recently. That answer seemed to surprise him more than anything else. Perhaps he expected me to have secretly planned everything. The truth was simpler. Margaret had simply understood people better than most of us did. Helen quietly wiped a tear from her eye. That sounds exactly like her, she whispered. For several minutes nobody spoke. Then Jason finally broke the silence. I made mistakes. The words hung in the air. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just quiet. I looked at him carefully. For the first time in a long while, I was not evaluating his excuses or defending his choices in my own mind. I was simply listening. I thought I was helping, he continued. I thought I was preparing for the future. Thomas calmly replied. Preparation and assumption are not always the same thing. Jason lowered his eyes. Ashley remained unusually quiet. Eventually she spoke. We did not realize how much had already been arranged. I nodded slowly. Neither did I. The conversation that followed was different from anything I would have expected a few months earlier. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody stormed out. Nobody made dramatic accusations. Instead, facts were acknowledged. Decisions were reviewed. Boundaries were clarified. At one point, Jason looked directly at me and said, "What happens now?" I folded my hands on the table. "Now we move forward honestly." He waited for more. "The structure your mother created remains in place," I continued. "The oversight remains in place. The accountability remains in place." He nodded slowly. I could see that he understood. This was not punishment. This was reality. The difference mattered. Before leaving, I established one final boundary. Trust is not rebuilt through promises, I said calmly. Trust is rebuilt through actions repeated consistently over time. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged the statement. Deep down, I think everyone in the room knew it was true. When the meeting finally ended, people gathered their papers quietly. Helen hugged me before leaving. Thomas shook my hand. Ashley offered a small nod. Jason lingered near the doorway for a moment. It looked as though he wanted to say something more. Instead, he simply left. A few minutes later, I found myself standing alone by the hospital window overlooking Charleston Harbor. The afternoon sun reflected across the water. Everything had changed. The truth was finally visible. The boundaries were finally established. Yet as I stood there watching the boats move slowly across the harbor, I realized that facts can resolve confusion, but they do not immediately heal a wounded family. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether healing was still possible at all. 6 months later, life looked very different than it had on that painful afternoon when I stood outside the church feeling as though everything I loved had collapsed around me. The business was stable. The governance structure Margaret created was working exactly as she intended. Decisions were transparent. Responsibilities were clear. The confusion and uncertainty that once surrounded every conversation had slowly been replaced by accountability and trust. Not perfect trust, earned trust. The kind that develops slowly and carefully over time. Jason remained part of the family, but our relationship was different now. Healthier in some ways. More honest. We spoke occasionally. Sometimes over coffee. Sometimes during business meetings. Sometimes during family gatherings. The distance between us had not disappeared overnight, and perhaps some scars never fully disappear. But both of us had learned something important. Relationships cannot survive on assumptions. They survive on truth. Ashley had also changed. There were fewer excuses and more listening. Fewer expectations and more gratitude. Even Helen once remarked, Margaret would be proud of how everyone is finally learning to see each other clearly. I think she was right. As for me, I eventually established the Margaret Bennett Community Foundation. It supported local educational programs, family assistance initiatives, and scholarship opportunities throughout Charleston and the surrounding area. Every year, dozens of young people received opportunities that might otherwise have passed them by. The first time I attended one of the scholarship ceremonies, I found myself smiling in a way I had not smiled in a very long time. Margaret's legacy was no longer confined to old photographs, legal documents, or memories. It was alive in the lives of others. One evening, after a foundation event, I returned home and sat alone on the back porch overlooking the water. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and amber. A gentle breeze moved through the oak trees. For the first time in many months, I felt something deeper than relief. I felt peace. Not because everything had worked out perfectly. It had not. Not because nobody had made mistakes. We all had. And not because pain had disappeared. Some losses stay with us forever. Peace came because I finally understood something Margaret had been trying to teach me all along. Boundaries are not punishments. Boundaries are acts of self-respect. Protecting your heart does not mean becoming cold. Protecting your finances does not mean becoming selfish. Protecting your future does not mean you love your family any less. It simply means you understand your own value well enough not to surrender it carelessly. Looking back now, I realized that the greatest loss I suffered was not financial. It was not professional. It was the moment I almost allowed other people to define my worth. The moment I nearly forgot who I was. If you are listening to this story today, and someone has made you feel invisible, unimportant, or uncertain about your value, I hope you hear this clearly. Your worth does not decrease because someone fails to recognize it. Your kindness should never require self-abandonment. Your love should never require surrendering your dignity. Trust your instincts. Pay attention to what your heart quietly knows. Sometimes God speaks to us through wisdom, through timing, through people who care about us, and sometimes through difficult experiences that force us to grow into stronger versions of ourselves. Thank you for spending this time with me. Truly, life can be difficult, and sometimes the hardest battles happen inside our own families. If this story helped you feel a little less alone, then sharing it has been worth every word. My name is Richard Bennett. I am 74 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this: never lose yourself while trying to keep the peace for everyone else. Before I end, I would love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, and if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so we can continue these conversations together. There are many more stories waiting in this journey. Stories about family, resilience, second chances, and unexpected wisdom. Somewhere in the next story, you may find a lesson you need exactly when you need it. Until then, take care of yourself, trust what you know in your heart, and remember that sometimes the most important thing we inherit is not money or property, but the courage to become who we were always meant to be. As I finished my coffee that evening, I noticed Margaret's old blue sweater folded neatly on the chair beside me, gently moving in the breeze, and for a brief moment it felt as though she was still reminding me that real strength is not found in controlling others, but in never allowing yourself to be forgotten.